Hey internets. So if you've been reading the news or watching any mass media pundits for the current election cycle this year, you've probably heard of something called Project 2025, which is a plan for conservative leadership presented in a roughly just over 922-page book, which was created by the Heritage Foundation, titled 2025 Mandate for Leadership. Now recently, I decided to read this book, and that's what this video is going to be about. In this video, I'm going to give an honest summary of what this Project 2025 is actually about, go over the pros and cons of some of the stuff that's actually in the mandate, and refute some of the mainstream media propaganda and fear-mongering about Project 2025. Because, surprise, surprise, mass media has once again not been very honest with you on this topic. In fact, if you get your information from just watching cable TV news, chances are pretty good that everything you've heard about Project 2025 was an extreme over-exaggeration, or cherry-picking, or some other form of dishonest reporting. Because one of the things I noticed when I was about 1/4 through this book is I started to realize that it's pretty darn obvious that the vast majority of mainstream media pundits, as well as breadtube leftists on YouTube and whatnot, bringing up their various grievances about this project, have very clearly not read it at all. I don't think any of the pundits on CNN have read it. I don't think any of the pundits on MSNBC have read it. Pretty much every single talking head you've seen whining about this book have not actually read it. And if you just so happen to have read this book as well, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Which is unfortunate, really. It kind of shows the problem with mass media today, as well as the problem with just general political commentators, is that a lot of people see nothing wrong with commentating on a political plan that they clearly have not read. Due to the extreme mainstream media bias, I am again partnering with Ground News. Mass media narratives these days rarely come without bias, with Project 2025 being just one of the endless examples. And Ground News helps you see through this bias by going through thousands of news articles and organizing them for you in ways that give context on where their political bias lies. For example, let's look up Project 2025 using their search feature. There's been a lot of heat about this topic, and Ground News has compiled hundreds of articles with a convenient graphic showing the political leaning of where the articles are coming from. Using this, we can easily see at a single glance that most of the Project 2025 hype is actually coming from mostly just the center left, telling you that the topic itself is likely loaded with a hint of partisan bias before taking it too seriously. You can also see simplified summaries for each article generated to save you even more time. Another feature related to this is Blind Spot. It lets you see which stories are being over or underreported by the left or right. This is an extremely useful feature due to the fact that reporting bias and agenda setting is one of the most common forms of mass media manipulation, and Ground News provides this extremely easy way to see through it and know which stories are being unreasonably amplified or ignored. Like this one right here. Confidence in the media falls to new low ahead of presidential election, disproportionately ignored by left-leaning outlets. Gee, I wonder why that could be. Ground News also has a lot of good features like these bias distribution charts for every topic, giving a quick visual representation of news outlets and their political leanings. Lastly, Ground News is independent and subscriber funded, so to get the same features I have, you can go to ground.news/mentiswave or scan my QR code to get 40% off the Vantage plan, which grants you unlimited access. Now, first off, I'm just going to give you a brief explanation of this book, which is actually kind of difficult to do because this mandate behind Project 2025 is actually quite complex. But to put it into an extreme nutshell, the book provides a framework plan to take power away from the managerial class within the administrative state, and then either redistribute that power to the president, or consolidate and combine various agencies into one agency. And much of the content of Mandate for Leadership can be summarized as a conservative critique of the fact that too much power is currently in the hands of thousands of state-chosen bureaucratic elites, mostly put into power by the DNC, and that most of these bureaucrats are implementing an extreme far-left agenda that most Americans would not be okay with if they understood what was really going on. And it tries to accomplish this by going into very comprehensive detail what various government bureaucracies do, what various agencies do, what a lot of these three-letter agencies do, and how and if they can be reformed, as well as various legal reforms. So here's just a brief summary. Mandate for Leadership is broken down into 5 sections, each with chapters detailing wide-scale reforms on dozens of government agencies. The first section, Taking the Reins of Government, is centered around the claim that the greatest threat to America is coming from within, and that this threat is in the form of a massive net of unaccountable government bureaucracy. It goes over how the people that are chosen for White House staff greatly affect the presidency and a president's ability to enact their agenda, since it's impossible for one single person to possibly manage the complex tasks of the White House without delegation of some sort. So it goes into the chiefs of staff and duties of various advisors, various committee members, and the details of what they do, etc., etc., and explains how many members' duties overlap in ways that create confusion and inefficiency, as well as various ideas to reduce this inefficiency and bring down costs. It makes the argument that the president is supposed to have more direct power over the executive branch, and it uses the Constitution to try and justify this, and also explains why this is currently not the case, to such a degree that three-letter agencies can actually go rogue and subversively work against the president if they so choose. And this creates a very big problem because it causes an internal conflict that results in massive amounts of money wasted, as taxpayers are basically funding bureaucrats to intentionally not do their jobs. And it also explains what some of these bureaucrats do, complains that it is too difficult in the modern era to fire them for ineptitude, and in general is a critique of a lot of how the power structures work. In many ways, the first section kind of struck me as a form of Moldbug light, in that it gives strong critique of invisible power structures created by bureaucracy, and how they allow middle officials to easily get away with corruption, subversion, and just general backstabbing, sabotage, tomfoolery that they would not be able to get away with if more people were paying attention to their actions. Now, this kind of creates a problem where people may not know who is at fault for when things go wrong. The common man's knee-jerk reaction is to blame the president, but in reality, when you have an organization as massive and complex as the United States government, which is broken into hundreds of different agencies and bureaucracies and etc., it actually works more like a series of tens of thousands of cogs through hundreds of different agencies, all that kind of have to work in tandem to get things done. So the truth is that many problems in function are often caused by the actions of faceless bureaucrats rather than the direct leader. The difference here is Moldbug goes more into depth into the philosophy and history behind this and uses it as a demonstration of the failures of democracy to weed out corruption and as a justification for reinstated monarchy as the primary system of rule. Whereas Mandate for Leadership or Project 2025 doesn't do that. Project 2025 is not arguing in favor of a dictatorship or arguing in favor of monarchy. It does not do that. Rather, Mandate for Leadership is more or less a soft version of this. Shut down some of the worst offending government agencies and restaff the rest with those who are loyal to the president, and consolidate and combine various agencies to make it less complex, and of course less wasteful of resources. And that these elected officials, including the president, would be limited more by the Constitution and would be loyal to the Constitution. At least that's their theory. Project 2025 also isn't really arguing for an increase to the power of government, but rather is an argument for restructuring it so that the people who are actually elected are the ones who have more of a say. Kind of like a weird fusion of democracy and monarchy, with an oversimplified theory behind it that putting more power into the hands of the elected rather than a managerial class bureaucracy thus returns power to the people. Hence why I call it Moldbug light. So Project 2025 is more like a return to the 80s strategy, believing it can reform democracy back to some recondite former glory that it allegedly had. Then in Section 2, the Common Defense was about reforming the military and foreign affairs to be more in line with conservative interests. For instance, it criticized the Department of Defense for wasteful spending, and argues for reforms based on the peace through strength strategy and increasing accountability at the higher ranks of the military. It also identifies China as sort of the main major threat to the United States, and to reform the military around this assessment. It also floats the idea of dismantling the DHS, or Department of Homeland Security, and consolidating and combining several agencies as well as privatization of some of them. And it largely argues for more border control and the merging of government agencies that deal with immigration, such as combining ICE with other various agencies that deal with immigration, as well as new policies that they claim will improve expedited removal of the illegals and raising the bar for asylum seekers to prevent abuse of the system. It also justifies greater immigration control by accusing Mexico of being run as a cartel state, effectively accusing them of being controlled by the cartels, as well as general conservative desires such as preventing Iran from gaining nukes, and stricter foreign policy against Russia, North Korea, Iran, etc. It also talks about reforming foreign aid, or USAID, to be more about charity and less about politics. It accuses the Biden administration of using foreign aid as a sort of soft bribery. So it argues for a reduction to this funding and a reduction to foreign aid in general, but to at least pre-COVID levels, and criticizes Biden's climate change policies that are built into it. It also argues for a complete cessation of all US aid in regards to DEI programs. That's something that a Mandate for Leadership in Project 2025 is pretty heavy on. Anytime it runs into DEI within any of the agencies that it's criticizing, it goes pretty heavy-handed into wanting it to be removed. Anyway, the next section was about general welfare. It's welfare spending and the national debt, and it also argues for shutting the DOE down and returning education to state control, as well as partially abolishing the FBI, not shutting it down completely, but just getting rid of the FBI's ability to investigate themselves and discover that they did nothing wrong, and reducing their scope to be about crime only. Now, it's important to point out here that when they say shutting down the Department of Education, they don't actually mean shutting down education. I'll go a bit more into that when I get into debunking some of the propaganda around Project 2025, but it's not actually getting rid of education funding. Rather, instead, it's more of a return to the Friedmanite idea of public funding, but local control as opposed to Fed control. So it argues strongly in favor of school choice and increased competition in the field of education rather than getting rid of education. So anybody who tells you that Project 2025 is about just dismantling education and by shutting down the Department of Education and they leave it at that, they're taking it out of context. This section also shows some data on how equity policies since Obama have led to a noticeable decline in literacy, as well as some for math. And it also argues for defining sex and education-based agencies as what was assigned at birth by a doctor. So there's definitely some conservative ideas against gender ideology in here as well. And in regards to the Department of Energy, it argues for eliminating ESG and green-based regulations, as well as just tons and tons and tons of reforms. That's another important thing to understand about Project 2025, is that it suggests a lot of reforms, such as reforming the HUD and reducing its spending and ending all equity programs like PAVE or AFFH. It also massively criticized the Department of Justice of being hijacked by a predominantly leftist managerial class and details several examples of abuse of power, such as providing misleading information to social media owners. So Facebook, Twitter, etc. It also argues for a thorough review of nearly all of these agencies' policies and to abolish anything that doesn't align with American interests, although it doesn't really go into good detail what it means by that, but probably meaning conservative interests. Then Section 4 in regards to the economy was about, of course, you probably guessed, reforming the economy to be more in line with general GOP desires, including less power to the IRS and overall less taxation, but again, reforming rather than outright abolishing. With the exception of the Fed, it does float the idea to consider abolishing the Federal Reserve and to adopt a policy of free banking in its place, with a potential return to the gold standard. And once again, it's arguing for reforming a whole lot of agencies, such as reforming the Small Business Administration to be more in line with conservative loyalists. Now, one interesting thing about the economy section is that it gave ideas for both a fair trade version, protectionism or fair trade, and free trade vision. And that kind of stood out to me, that they kind of gave a case for both. Because it shows you that the people behind Project 2025 know that no one's going to actually agree with everything in the book. It's extremely unlikely for all of these reforms to actually happen. Mainly because, if you actually read the book, you realize just how complex and in extreme detail it goes into how these things will be reformed. It is an insane, massive amount of work to do. And I kind of personally doubt that any one president could actually do Project 2025, even if they made it their sole purpose for being in office. Then finally in Section 5, it talks about independent regulatory agencies. So it goes into reforming a lot of agencies, just as the FCC, and criticizes the current issue that presidents can appoint people to these various regulatory agencies, but cannot remove them, which then leads to widespread abuse. So you have a ton of these regulators who are basically accountable to no one. And well, that's identified as a problem. So again, it floats the idea of abolishing some of them, but mostly reconsolidating, combining, and reforming. In fact, if I were to summarize a lot of Project 2025 and the book A Mandate for Leadership, the way the book largely reads is something like this. Here's a bad thing happening, here's what this government agency currently does, and here's how we should reform them. And the book just kind of repeats that format for dozens upon dozens of various government agencies. But overall, the goal that they claim to have can be found on page 36. It brings up 4 broad fronts that will decide America's future. 1, restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children. 2, dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. 3, defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats. And 4, secure our God-given individual rights to live freely, what our Constitution calls the blessings of liberty. That's how the Heritage Foundation is selling it anyway. But anyways, next up I'd like to go into a little bit of criticism I have about this book. There are some ideas in this mandate that are less than amazing. In fact, this is one of the reasons I know that most leftists have not read this book at all, because there are actually some better critiques against it that most of them have largely ignored. Now, the first problem is that Mandate for Leadership doesn't always do a very good job of providing data as graphs to back up its claims. It does cite sources, and it does a very good job doing that, but there's only a couple times in the book where it actually shows graphs, mostly only doing that when it went into education and testing scores over time. But it didn't do it enough, and so the book kind of appears to just be making wide claims and assuming that they're true. And I didn't really see any lefties pointing that out, which again is not surprising because of course they haven't actually read the book. But yeah, anyways, another criticism I have is there's not enough reduction of government power. Instead, it's mostly just a reconsolidation. Again, a ridiculous portion of Mandate for Leadership can be summarized as Mull reforms. This is what this agency does, this is what this law does, reform, reform, reform. Hundreds of pages of that. It is interesting, I will give it that. There's very few books out there that actually do as good of a job as this book in briefly describing what certain agencies do. So anyone who's interested in how the United States government works to some degree, I actually would recommend reading this book. It's pretty good in that regard. But it also does that and goes on and on and on. This is what this agency does. This is how it should be reformed. This is what this agency does. This is how it should be reformed. Reform, 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 reform. More reforms, more reforms. And to some degree, that's a problem, because a lot of these agencies really can't be reformed. They should just be outright abolished. For example, in Chapter 8 on page 245, it acknowledges the fact that the United States Agency for Global Media has been arguably, well, a total waste of taxpayer money for decades. Okay, well, if that's the case, then why not just get rid of them? These agencies clearly aren't doing anything necessary for the nation to function, as proven by the fact that we are clearly doing just fine without them functioning. If some bureaucracy or three-letter agency has been clearly not doing anything useful for decades at a time, then well, that's proof that you don't need the agency. So the better option is to just abolish them and return the resources that were taken to fund them back to the taxpayer. That's kind of my main critique of Project 2025, is that it's trying too hard to save sinking ships, when in reality we should just let them fail. We should let them sink. We don't need them. If it's wasting money and not doing anything, just get rid of it. This is sadly kind of the main difference between Republicans and right-wing libertarians. Republicans always fall for this idea that they can save these statist projects, when in reality we can just get rid of them. Why does the government need to have a hand in media at all on the taxpayer's dime? We don't need state-funded radio shows targeted at foreigners, because if people did actually want it, then they would pay for it voluntarily, rather than costing the taxpayer hundreds of millions of dollars to fund a radio show that we don't care about. Now, to the mandate's credit, Project 2025 does recognize that it's possible to just abolish it if they can't reform it. The problem is they get it backwards. They place reforming first instead of abolishing first, when really they should be looking if it's realistically possible to abolish things first, which creates a little bit of a problem, because it makes it very easy for dishonest people on the far left to cherry-pick this book and represent it as being authoritarian, because a lot of the ideas essentially boil down to kick Democrats out of bureaucratic control and put Republicans in control. Now, in truth, when they do that, it's not actually an increase to government, it's just changing who's in charge. And again, taking the entire book in context, overall this mandate is arguing for an overall reduction in government power. But again, that's not going to stop the disingenuous cherry pickers. And it would be a lot easier for people like me to call out that dishonesty if the strategy was more focused on abolishing corrupt bureaucracies, rather than just trying to take control of them. And that may seem like a really generic take coming from a libertarian like me, but again, if you look at a lot of the leftist disinformation campaigns against Project 2025, well, I'm right. They make a lot of pedantically correct statements against Project 2025. They're wrong, of course, and it's very obvious when you actually read the book again that they're wrong. But the problem is, they know that most people aren't actually going to read this book, because admittedly it's not the easiest read, and the only thing that really keeps it interesting is that it's an explanation of how various agencies work from a conservative standpoint, which is something that you don't really see very often. So at least from a literary standpoint, that for me was really the main part of the book and really the only thing that stopped me from falling asleep on it. But again, because a lot of the focus is just on change the D's here to R's, it's not really offering a good enough principled stance against anything, which makes it very easy for the entire plan to be attacked. And another problem is that there's an obvious disconnect between what Trump is saying at his rallies and his debate and town hall performances and whatnot, and what is in Project 2025's mandate for leadership book. In other words, Trump himself not only has distanced himself from Project 2025, but if you've read the book and you listen to Trump, you realize that it really isn't Trump's policy. It's very obvious if you're a person who's read this book and you listen to Trump speak every now and then, that Project 2025 is in fact not secretly Trump's agenda at all. Because as it turns out, it's pretty darn obvious that Trump hasn't read the book either, because the book does a fairly decent job criticizing invisible power structures and bureaucracy, and if Trump had read the book, he would at least be doing as good a job as this book. He would at least be borrowing from the book. And I know this isn't really criticism of the book itself, it's just worth pointing out that it's actually pretty obvious that it's not really as hardly connected to Trump as the media wants to say that it is. Now, to be fair, I'm aware that this is more criticism of Donald Trump than it is criticism of Project 2025. It's just worth pointing out that there's some obvious communication issues within the GOP leadership due to the fact that Trump himself doesn't really seem to understand this massive project that a bunch of these conservative think tanks have come up with, which then leads to some real criticism, which means that Project 2025, a mandate for leadership, is more or less just a suggestion at best. There's a lot of big-name conservatives behind it, so there's a good chance that if Trump were to get into office that some of the things would happen, but it would almost certainly be a very, very, very small fraction. In other words, the book is not as important as people think it is. If it was actually a serious part of Trump's agenda, you would expect there to be a much greater level of overlap with Trump's rhetoric and what's in the book. I mean, there's definitely some overlap, and I'll get into that later, but the overlap that exists is more coincidental than anything else. And that's mainly due to just how extensive this project is. But, of course, none of the leftists complaining about Project 2025 would have noticed that because, of course, none of them have read the book either. Another criticism I have is that it recommends a lot of large-scale military projects and increased funding, like building hundreds of more ships and fighter jets, despite its criticism of wasteful spending, so basically Chapter 4 sucks. Another problem is that it occasionally makes the Republican fallacy of arguing for internal socialism as opposed to open border socialism, which admittedly, internal socialism is less bad than open border socialism, because you can't have open border socialism. That'll pretty much drain the coffers immediately, but they do argue for it. For example, on page 167, we get this little line right here, ensuring that only U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents utilize or occupy federally subsidized housing, when really we just shouldn't have federally subsidized housing, as subsidized housing tends to increase the cost of housing for people who are not on subsidized housing. It hurts the housing crisis rather than fixes it. And lastly, in many ways, Project 2025 is too complex for its own good. It regularly goes into extreme detail of its plans on what department or agency should do what, or how it should be reconstructed to do some new thing, or how it should be combined with some other agency, to the point where it becomes a little bit outrageous. Because, again, remember, Project 2025 is, at best, a suggestion. Trump is under no obligation whatsoever to follow it. It's not actually his policy proposal, but the proposal of various think tanks, and thus even if Trump wins, and even if he does put some of the contributors to the Mandate for Leadership book in his team, one can only realistically expect a very small fraction of these ideas put forth to actually be put into action, even if Trump were to shift gears and be serious about actually implementing Project 2025. Because there's just so many reforms recommended in this book that it would be almost darn near impossible to actually implement them all in a single term. Or in other words, it's just a little bit too ambitious for its own good. And I know for sure it's definitely not going to be able to implement all of its ideas, even if it were to gain the power needed to do so, because some of them are just really unpopular. For instance, it suggests rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that's just a flat-out no. TPP has a lot of stuff in it that would require an expansion of the surveillance state for it to actually work. It's a massive scam to the average consumer. There's a reason people didn't like it, and it's a good thing that Trump pulled out of it. Now, on the flip side, there are, however, some really good things in Project 2025. For example, it crashes down pretty hard on disparate impact theory. It specifically states, eliminate disparate impact as a valid theory of discrimination for race and other bases under Title VII and other laws. That is a very good thing. I've kind of floated that before as a sort of compromise between right libertarians and Republicans when it comes to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Abolishing disparate impact wouldn't completely restore freedom of association, so it wouldn't be perfect, but abolishing the disparate impact standard is pretty good because it at the very least prevents the law from being abused by far leftist and other neo-Marxist activists. So that's a very good idea. And just in general, the book also explains that it needs to have a very heavy-handed removal of Marxist indoctrination where it can. And another good thing about the book just in general, which is something I wasn't expecting to find when I jumped into it, is that it's actually, again, one of the most comprehensive explanations of how various agencies in the federal government work. While this was what this agency and this institution does, and this is how it can be reformed sort of rhetoric that you see throughout the book can seem a little bit repetitive at times. On the flip side, it does provide a fairly good explanation of what these agencies do if you're not familiar with them. So if you're interested in what various bureaucracies within the federal government actually do and what their function actually is, this book is a pretty darn good read. And it also floats a few other base things in it. For instance, it does float the idea of abolishing the Fed and returning to the gold standard, or free banking. And it also advocates for privatizing certain agencies such as the TSA. And again, I really liked how it went into abolishing the Department of Education. The federal government really doesn't need a place in education at all. And these days, the DOE mainly just serves as an indoctrination pipeline. And finally, probably the best thing is that overall, it does argue for more deregulation and consolidating and removing agencies more so than it argues for increasing the federal government. And it does identify a few things about times of regulation that have led to problems and supply issues. For example, it correctly identifies how overregulation has led to a supply issue with baby formula. And what this means is that even if we were to pretend like Project 2025 and the book Mandate for Leadership actually is Trump's agenda, compared to what Kamala Harris is selling, it's still the lesser of two evils. Project 2025 is in fact not some evil, newtsy, wooshist takeover of the American government. Unless you're dealing with one of those people who believes that newtsyism is when Republicans control the United States government instead of Democrats controlling the United States government, which is completely ridiculous and an obviously unserious argument. And speaking of the ridiculous, I would like to end this video with going over and refuting some nonsensical mainstream media propaganda and fear-mongering about this project. Because before I read the book, I could tell that the media was lying about it, but now that I have read the book, it is quite painfully obvious that just about everything mass media has to say about it is completely disconnected from reality and has little to nothing to do with what the Heritage Foundation is actually pushing for here. The first of these is just this blatant association fallacy coming from CNN, where it says that, hey, 140 people worked for Trump and they're involved with Project 2025, therefore Trump is lying about claiming to not know who's behind the project. Therefore, Project 2025 must secretly ooga booga booga be Trump's actual agenda. Fear, 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 be afraid. Now, the problem with this is that Project 2025 has contributions from over 60 conservative think tanks and hundreds of independent contributors. And of course, each of those think tanks often have hundreds of members of their own. And again, lots and lots and lots of people have worked for Donald Trump. So it's actually not statistically amazing at all that there's about 140 people who have an overlap here. It would actually be very unlikely for there to be nobody who worked for Trump who was also involved with Project 2025 in some way. It's not uncommon at all for people who work for various think tanks of a party to be put into various bureaucratic positions or something by a president of that party. So CNN is being completely ridiculous here, and that they're taking something that is statistically expected and presenting it in this very fallacious way as to imply that there's some secret nefarious conspiracy happening here. It is entirely within reasonable expectation for this to probably just be a coincidence. It doesn't actually mean anything. And then the same exact thing is true when it comes to policy overlap with Donald Trump's platform and Project 2025. Again, it would be very statistically unlikely for Trump's plan to have absolutely nothing in common with the plan of a bunch of dozens of the conservative think tanks. So the fact that there's some overlap between what Trump's platform is and what's in Project 2025 is entirely expected, and again, is entirely within reason to just expect it to be a coincidence. You could do the exact same thing with Harris's platform, or with Biden's platform, or really with any DNC person's platform. You can just as easily take their plan and then compare it to the ideas put forth behind a bunch of leftist or left-leaning or liberal think tanks. And of course, you're gonna have some obvious overlap there. Some of the ideas coming from various intellectual think tanks, well, obviously some of those are going to end up into the policy proposals of a politician. Therefore, people are making a big deal out of absolutely nothing here. Oh no, there's a conservative who has a bunch of ideas that overlap with a bunch of conservative think tanks. Ooh boy, clearly there's some kind of nefarious conspiracy between the two. It's just pure freaking hysteria, honestly. It's actually kind of embarrassing that Americans are biffed by this. Another thing I'd like to refute is MSNBC's blatant projection and misrepresentation of Chapter 9. It accuses Project 2025 of trying to abuse the US foreign aid system to export culture wars. The problem is that if you actually read Chapter 9, which MSNBC probably doesn't actually want its viewers to do, you will find out that what Project 2025 actually does is it criticizes the Biden administration of doing just that. It criticizes Biden for using US aid as a way of a form of global platform to pursue culture wars. So it's entirely just projection. I actually did a whole video of this on a MA episode. I did a MA culture wars episode. It's very common for some reason for leftists to use culture wars as kind of a bizarre projection mechanism where they accuse you of doing what they're doing. It's very weird, and if you read the book, it's actually very obviously false. The reforms that Project 2025 actually puts forth and actually recommends for US aid is mostly removing certain things from it. For instance, removing DEI, gender, and climate equity programs from it. Their plan is actually about making it less partisan and more about just direct charity rather than having an agenda tied to it. And the vast majority of Chapter 9 goes into great detail how Biden did exactly what MSNBC is accusing the board of Project 2025 of doing here. It's completely absurd, and it shows just how little respect MSNBC has for its audience, because they clearly don't believe that their audience is going to actually read the book and fact check them on this one. And lastly, I just want to go over some of Kamala Harris's lies about the project, as well as roasting PolitiFact a bit for rating one of her statements as half-true when it's pretty blatantly false. We have this right here of Kamala Harris stating in an ad, Project 2025 would defund K-12 schools, and PolitiFact rates this as half-true. Yeah, no, that is a full lie. Dismantling the Department of Education does not at all in any way equate to defunding K-12 schools. Especially if you, again, read the book. It specifically states in the chapter about dismantling the Department of Education that the actual plan they have is to just return education to state control rather than federal government control. So it would still be getting publicly funded, under Project 2025's plan. It would just be getting funded on a state-per-state basis. That's not something you rate as half true. That's pretty blatantly false. Or at the very least, it should get a mostly false. But that doesn't matter, I guess, because for some reason the mass media has chosen to latch on to Project 2025 as their main fear-mongering stick in order to get people to vote for Harris, I guess. Which is honestly kinda silly and kinda sad, because really, Project 2025 and the book A Mandate for Leadership is overall really just a plan, again, to implement a form of Old Bug Light. It's really just a plan to take bureaucratic control away from people who have abused it. And in many ways, it's honestly kinda milquetoast and pretty basic and pretty general conservative Republican stuff, which is honestly kind of what you'd expect. I mean, if you just read the contributors list and see all the general conservative think tanks involved with it, it's not surprising at all that Project 2025 would, in reality, just be generic conservative stuff. And while the book is an interesting read if you want to get a conservative perspective of how multiple institutions within the federal government actually operate, overall, it's just not as important as people seem to think it is. Anyways, that is all. Thanks for watching. Feel free to comment and subscribe and all of that good stuff. And if you enjoyed the video, you can support me on Subscribestar, or giving me a tip on Ko-Fi, or by becoming a channel member, which will give your comments a nice badge on them. Or alternatively, you can buy some merch from my merch store, which I've been making some new hats for lately. But yeah, again, thanks for watching. Till next time.